I am here with Michel Bauwens and Daniel Garner of OG Rose and a number of the members of the Voicecraft Network who will be joining us in about 30 to 45 minutes time. We're here following a thread that was raised in a previous conversation we had with Forrest in the Value and Civilisation series. And the intention is to discuss the relationship between crypto and commons. And so to begin with, I'm going to offer the first question actually to yourself, Michel. I'm kind of hoping in this first 30 minutes to get a little bit of a sense of what the world of crypto represents in the context of the possibility for economic exchange and how that relates to society. Obviously, you bring an immense amount of interest and scholarship with respect to the meaning of commons as well. So perhaps if you could give a brief description of what that term means for you in this kind of context, that would be great.
I'd like to start with a kind of an analogy, I'm not an expert in Hegel at all, so Daniel will correct me. But I think one of his concepts was the rules of reason. And I think he applied it to Napoleon, whatever Napoleon's motivations were in, conquering Europe. But in fact, he spread bourgeois legislation throughout the continent, the civil code, right? So sometimes you achieve things without any conscious intent yourself. And I think I just want to say that because I'm going to say a lot of things about crypto and its relations to the commons, which people in crypto may not fully recognize themselves because they're not in that, they don't use the vocabulary. Maybe they're not even, they're often libertarian. And so I wrote this a bit of provocative title editorial on my Substack about Ron Paul Maoism. And so the subtitle was, why are crypto libertarians carrying out Karl Marx's program? And, that's kind of a provocative title, but there's something behind it, right? So in order to, I know first, how I define the commons for people who are not familiar with it, it's a shared resource, which is created, protected, maintained by a community or a group of stakeholders with their own regulation, so self-regulated. So it's an object in a certain sense, although it can be immaterial. It's a social object, something people collaborate around. It's an act of will, so it's an action, it's a verb. Commoning, there is no commons without commoning. So it used to be that people used to think, especially economists, that the commons was for a particular kind of goods. I think if I remember correctly, non-arrival and non-excludable. I'm not sure. It's one of the creators of Samuelson. But I think today we're kind of saying no. It's an option. You can manage any resource in a public way, meaning using the state and collectivity, or in a private way, using market pricing as the guide to allocate resources, or you can choose the commons way, which is a particular, it's an institutional form. So market, state, and commons, you should see them as three possible options to organize any society. So I just want to say that up front. So in that kind of broad, idea, I think we can say that humanity, for most of its life, lived in tribal, kinship-based environments where commoning and the gift economy, which are different, but they're kind of related to each other, were the main way of exchanging value. And that was true until 5,000 years ago, where some humans created more complex societies, what we call civilization, with writing, armies, states, markets, and all of that, right? So my main idea is that we're reaching a new pivot. So in short, to give you again an historical framing, 19th century for me is the age of markets. Free markets, laissez-faire, laissez-aller. It works well for certain things. It quintuples the average wage of the working class in one century. an enormous amount of technical innovations, but it ends because it has internal contradictions with World War One and World War Two. And then comes a second era where, so if the market on its own doesn't work, what do we do? And so the answer was we need a state, right? The full state, like in the Soviet form of communism, some kind of state market fusion, like in fascism, or eventually the welfare state model that came out of the parliamentary democracies. And so this is another 100 years for me, which ended in 2008. And so now we can ask the question, are we now not entering the era of distributed networks, right? In which the market and the state by itself are not seen as solutions anymore, in which people want independence, autonomy, sovereignty outside of market and state conditioning. And so then to go back to crypto, so one of the things you could say is when we created market and states, that was because there was a new class of people who knew how to write. So, the alphabet, in a way, was the vehicle to create a group of people who then creates a world at their image, which they can organize bureaucratically and through accounting, so markets and states. And you have to remember, until the Reformation, no more than 10% of people could read and write, right? So this was like the class that run the world, if you like. So now we have coders, and maybe we can think of coding as a new language, and they're a new group of people, and they want to create a world at their image. And so they want to be independent of the control of markets and states to the degree that they can. And they are engaged in a very selfish, in a way, in a very selfish endeavor of like, how can we arbitrage markets and states, especially in the declining phase of society and civilization, so that we can, build our own resilience on a world scale using this new type of territory and space that is the digital, right? So civilization is geographic. It's how to organize land and the relation between city and the rural. Uh, but now we're engaged in something else. We're engaged in trans-local self-organizing, right? And so what's so remarkable is, as a network play that they're engaged in, is that they're and I mean, maybe anticipating, we can go into details later, but they're already now able to tax themselves and to create common and public goods themselves out of the networks without resorting to market and state. And I found that pretty remarkable. Whether that's good or bad, let's put that on the side for the moment. But in terms of like societal and civilizational pivots, this is extremely important. And again, I'm not saying that this is what they want. I'm saying this is what they're actually doing, whether they want it or not. It's what the situation drives them to do as a labor aristocracy, as a group of people with similar worldviews and interests, with particular ideology, but an ideology that fits the time, right? So I'm not a libertarian myself. I'm actually quite critical of libertarianism. But you have to realize that these people, they're not working class people as we used to know them in the industrial system, right? All together in a space where they have to work together in order to obtain advantages, in a very unequal relationship with the people who employ them. This is not who they are. They're smallholders, each with their own computer. So they own their means of production like craftspeople, but they don't control the means of valuation that they need. And because that's still capitalist. And so what they're trying to do is create the means of valuation, the network around their autonomy that would allow them, to make a living as a new social group. Okay, I'll stop there, but that's kind of like my thesis.
Yeah, thank you, Michel. Daniel, what's at stake for you in this conversation?
Delightful. Well, it's always a treat, and Michel, it's a delight to speak with you again. I always look forward to it, and again, your work is a gift. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. So again, I am no technical expert on blockchain, crypto, or different things like that. And there are people here in the audience who are far better, and people listening in. Over the years, though, as I've tried to learn about it and look into it, it has brought, at the very least, what it has done is helped me see or frame problems that before I didn't even know were there. So for example, social security numbers. They're pretty boring. You don't really think about those. But without a social security number in the United States of America, you really can't function. Can't really do much, can't get a loan, can't get a house, probably can't do anything. But if you have a social security number, then you need a bureaucracy or middlemen to provide that social security number, to authenticate it, to give it authority, and so on and so forth. So automatically you're reliant on a state. Money. All right. So what do you need for money? You need banks, you need credit, you need all these different things. And if you don't have those, you can't buy anything. You're in trouble. You're basically homeless, right? Well, what does that mean? You need capital, right? And Michel and I were talking about a guy, his Koratani. He talks about the capital nation state, on the idea that it really won't do to think of modern civilizations as merely controlled by capital, or merely controlled by the state, or merely controlled by the nation. And nation, you might think of something like ethos, or how people identify nationalism and things like that, but that they all work together in a certain triplex to facilitate one another. So for example, 2008 comes along, capital markets collapse, the state runs in through Keynesianism and bails them out. So capital is fine. Capital goes down, and then the nation comes in because people who worked hard their entire lives feel like you're destroying or mocking their story, and then you get fascism running in to the defense of the state. So it all works together, and from the ground level, it looks like the nation, the capital, the nation, the state are enemies in a way, but actually they're all maintaining one another, as Koratani will talk about on the nation state. And you say, well, I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to support it. Okay, well, do you have a social security number? Yeah. Do you take loans out? Yeah. Okay. Do you have an address, birth certificate? And what I've really been very interested in, because I make distinctions, a lot of people talk about Bitcoin. And a lot of the talk on Bitcoin being about money is inefficient. You need a solid currency. I've heard Michael Snyder, he talks about like money is an energy source. And if central banks can inflate currency, then it's an inefficient energy source. And, I can tell you right now, when I go to the grocery store because of inflation, I'm like, man, money's pretty inefficient. This is terrible. And he's like, yeah, because money is fiat, and all fiat currencies are dead. And a lot of people go, oh, that's great. But what was fascinating to me is the more I went toward the blockchain, kind of distinct from just the Bitcoin, which is on the blockchain, and see how the blockchain is interested in the question of how do you create authoritative documents, authoritative documentation without reliance on a central planner or a central authority, right? Oh, well, that's pretty interesting, because here's the thing. So much as if I need a social, I'm just using the social security, you could talk about birth certificates, addresses, loans, whatever. So much as I'm relying on that, then I'm going to be paying taxes. Let's say I take out a loan, I'm paying 10% inflation. So it's all extracting. And I know Michel will talk about an economy of extraction. And a way to look at it is the blockchain can help with, and again, someone may come along and say, well, the technology's doomed because AI can uncrypt it or whatever. Okay, fine. We can get into the technical questions. But the point in what the conversation of blockchain at the very least can do is help frame how you're constantly being extracted here and there and losing value and not know it. So for example, when you send money across the ocean and PayPal tells you you're going to lose $50, you're like, why? Why am I losing $50 to send money across the ocean? And it's like, well, because you need it, right? Basically, as I understand it, blockchain would be like, no, you're not going to have that $50 extracted there. You don't need it, right? Or if you say, well, I need to sign up with the state to have an identity so I can get a loan, and then the state can document me and tax me, the blockchain's like, no, you're not going to need to do that. You're going to be able to have a reliable system of documentation that is not reliant on a central power, therefore can be decentralized. And then therefore, here's the other issue. Because apparently the argument is the blockchain cannot be manipulated, it becomes very reliable documentation, because that's one of the, like another way to think about it. In 2008, what happened? All the subprime mortgages were given high AAA credit ratings, right? And basically everyone, and it turned out that wasn't very reliable. Well, the blockchain would come along and say you can't do that. You can't, and then you can't have a managerial agency class that's extracting or creating money or different things to provide ratings that ultimately aren't even reliable. So the last thing I'll say and then pass it on, I think it can be helpful to associate when we think about the blockchain, questions like rating agencies, birth certificates, social security, fees, documentation, getting a loan, all these little problems. You're like, yeah, these are really inefficient. Yes, this requires reliance on a capital nation state. When you see that, and then you start talking about, well, what if you could save that 5% on every extraction? What if you could actually not have to pay a rating agency to tell if these subprime mortgages are reliable? A lot of people will talk about the professional managerial class as being kind of the defining feature of modern capitalism with Buchanan and all of that. The blockchain may actually be a way to deal with the problem of the professional managerial class because it can work against all the middlemen. And there's an argument to be made that it will be very difficult to have a commons if you have to have middlemen. Because if you have to have middlemen, then you have to have something external to the commons to provide the means of its liquidity or its identity or its the ways to fund it. And then the commons will always be taking place within the capital nation state at its mercy versus changing the conditions of possibility within the capital nation state to itself. There's more to be said, but it helps me when I think about the blockchain in terms of the problem of the professional managerial class, removing middlemen, not losing money here in fees that are being extracted here and there, and being able to have authoritative documentation without reliance on a central planner.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. That's really good. So, Michel, I have a thought that comes to mind that I do think for the sake of our whole exploration today, at least I'd be very interested in including into the mix. I'm curious if you're particularly wanting to respond to something, then there's openness for you to do so here. But otherwise, I'm kind of keen to put this forward and also to hear how you reflect on it.
Go ahead.
So partly the way we've explored commons in the many conversations we've had, and when I'm asked, what do I mean by that? Part of my influence on what I mean by that, Michel, comes from yourself, and particularly arguments at the level of institutional function that you make in terms of market, state, commons. And in that triple, would nationalism in this case be in the function, be in the same place, same conceptual place as the commons, just to be clear on that, when you were quoting that other author, Daniel? It was market, state, and nation, and market, state, and commons. So often the way I seem to begin to share how I'm exploring the meaning of commons is at a level of, it definitely maps along with what we hold in common, but it's kind of from the perspective of what makes possible communication. This is something we've touched on a little bit in previous conversations. But the very possibility for communication, that we can transfer signal and share signal with each other at all, speaks to a basis. People could talk about it in terms of substrate. If you wanted to be kind of more process relational about it, maybe someone could take issue with an appeal to substrate in terms of its ontological function in that construct. But certainly that we participate in a process relational cosmos reality. Again, what do we want to name? We want to name biology. We want to name chemicals. We want to name physics. Okay, well, depends how metaphysical we'd like to be. But there's something, to make this point a tiny bit clearer at a different level. We can talk about language, and if we are both sharing a language together, then that's something of value to both of us. And we kind of, for a language to become authenticated in exchange, has to be understood. Both of us have to sort of share it. And through doing that, we can benefit from that capacity to communicate and craft in relation. And I'm sure a bunch of other things too. So there's something about the essence of communication and what makes possible to exchange at all in a manner that confers genuine legitimacy, i.e., there's a real signal of touch, there's a real relationship. In some sense, we're talking about relationship and the dynamics that enable relationship. Now, that's how I often begin to speak about it, which is confusing for people encountering the notion at the first time, because it speaks, in fact, to some real areas of question for me. Now, I want to park that there, and because I want to introduce the main point that I'd like to bring in, which is questions around, for the world of blockchain, for the world of Bitcoin, questions around the meaning of legitimacy. I think, Daniel, the way you express the function of blockchain, absolutely, in terms of an authoritative structure that can reduce the need for middlemen or remove them completely, these types of things. I have questions about that. I think that's a perfectly reasonable articulation of what blockchains are purported to function as, and at the level of code and what have you. I think that's absolutely fair in terms of the functionality of the ledger and all of that. What I feel I've been able to locate as a core argument, and you mentioned Michael Saylor, who's probably chief Bitcoin evangelist, chief Bitcoin narratologist, the great mythologizer himself, or what he's conferring legitimacy through the narratives he tells. And downstream of this, we get things like grift. That's what kind of grift becomes. Pay attention to this blockchain, pay attention to this implementation of the technology, or this fork of Bitcoin, or this fork of thing. So what network are we going to be exchanging on? The core argument, as I've been able to locate it, people might disagree, in the context of Bitcoin, is what they call the Immaculate Conception. That there was something about Satoshi and what he did, and the fact he's not here anymore, / maybe he's dead, or maybe it was a group or whatever, but he's definitely not coming back, and he's a really good guy. He's almost a bit like Jesus. You know, there was an event, it could only happen one time, and because it happened first, and because he brought the shining golden jewel up from the mud, right, and just gave it as a free gift, we can trust that this is the network to use. Now, anybody with a lot of Bitcoin has a lot of incentive to champion that narrative, because they want that network to have exchange take place on it. And that's kind of a separate point from the utility of the technology itself. And so in some sense, there's this other layer of communication that's taking place, which is like, let's use this version of the technology enabling a particular kind of commons interaction. And that's and so it becomes a bit relevant, surely, to recognize that these two things are slightly different. We don't want to just mistake, and no one's saying that, of course, we don't just want to mistake blockchain for a one-to-one equivalency with the meaning of commons. That would obviously be it. No one's making that case. But I want to bring that in just in terms of the role that legitimacy is playing in here, and to include this social structure level, or the superstructural level of how we bind to ideas, how we treat each other and what have you. It seems very relevant in how we relate to the promise of crypto. And so with that said, Michel, I'd just like to pass it back over for you to take this wherever you like.
So maybe I would like to give you like a little narrative around trust, because I think this is one of the key things, right? So, okay, this is a stylized version. It's more complex, but I think you will follow my drift. So first of all, we start with tribal. Everybody knows each other. You know, you're the uncle, you're the aunt, the sister, the mother. So everybody around you loves you. You have enemies, but they're outside. And so I call this little brother, little sister, right? So you trust, and you can solve your issues by talking to somebody you trust, and then maybe there's the elders council, but basically that's kind of how it works, right? Then something happens, and some people posit some kind of climate catastrophe, which forces some tribes to invade some other one, or what's called Neolithic garden culture. They, some horticultural people, and they're richer than them, so they go and get it. So out of this comes the state, but through religion. So I would say that we go from little brother, little sister to big father, right? You have a shift from a matriarchal, horticultural societies to male dominated civilization with a big godhead on top of it, right? So why do you trust each other? Because everybody fears the same God, basically. So you're a Muslim, I'm a Muslim, you're a Christian, I'm a Christian. We can trust each other. Or you're the emperor or whatever. Okay. So then we go to the nation state. Like a historically constituted community that occupies a certain geography, believes in its own sovereignty, and that's the state. So that's Big Brother. What we call Big Brother. And I would argue, and this is more controversial, but that we are now in Big Mother. So the benevolent surveillance, safetyism. Don't talk about bad things about trans people, and we need hate speech, and so it's because of the academia and the media are very largely dominated, through by female values. This kind of protective, motherhood is now like what is the rule. And I think that the blockchain is reacting to, basically Big Brother, Big Father, and Big Mother to recreate a new version of Little Brother, Little Sister. But paradoxically, and that's the weird thing, is they're doing it to trustlessness, right? So that's a paradox, is that the highest point of trust is now trustlessness. Like, that's weird, but it's because we reach such a planetary level of abstraction, and that's where they want to create trust, that you can do business and make contracts with people you don't know, and that's actually very positive, right? You extend trust to trustlessness, but that is also then problematic because it kind of the undermines the whole idea of little brother, little sister, right? And so I think that then creates, it's what we used to call high touch, high tech, and I call it cosmolocalism, right? To be fully cosmic, so to be fully digital, and be able to work with people wherever they are around common social objects. And so I'm coming to my legitimacy, we'll get there. And at the same time, to restore the depth of human relationships by a new kind of tribalism that's no longer based exclusively on kinship, but on affinity. So I think that's where we are. We are trying to reorganize, retribalize the world around common social objects, and they provide a legitimacy. So why are we together in Linux? Because we all believe that we need a new operating system. Why are we doing crypto? Because we all believe we need, censorship resistant communication. And so it's a new type of nation, which, and I'm participating in one of these groups that's called coordinations. So, Primavera de Filippi and a number of researchers, they do this ongoing research on what are we creating? We're creating a new type of group, right? So we have the geographic nations, but now we're creating, what Jordan Hall calls civium, translocal civilization. And it also consists of nations, but the nations get their legitimacy from their translocal social object. So and so that whether you go to the moon or you want a new operating system, that creates like a new logic. Like the governance and the commons type of commons depends on your social object. Why are you together? What are you constructing together? But I also do believe that psychologically, it allows us to create identities beyond the nation state, right? So it's planetary, domain specific, and planetary. And so what we're still missing is that kind of binding element that we don't have yet. Like, what is going to be the binding element of all these new nations? That we don't know what that is. We're not there yet. But I think this is what we are moving towards.
Yes, well, that's a very interesting departure point. I feel a few things come to reflect on there. But instead of that, Mr. OG, where you at?
Oh, delightful. Well, I'm glad we brought up legitimacy. I think about the Habermas legitimacy crisis. I think about how nobody trusts politicians. I think the State of the Union is going on right now, and no one's too thrilled about that. Like, there's really generally this notion that nobody trusts anything, right? There's something about, dare I say, scale and pluralism and all of these things that naturally destroys trust, not because necessarily there's some conspiracy, but you just complexity, misunderstanding, different interests, and before long, people don't trust one another. Now, critically, trust is existential. If I have to actively choose to trust you, that is a choice that makes me vulnerable, and it is therefore psychologically difficult for me to do. And it takes very, very little breaking of my trust for me to then not trust anything, or to me to retreat to my tribe and to my people, right? And so trust is really difficult. And the more and more you move to a planetary scale of great diversity, the more and more of a cognitive burden you are putting on individuals to trust more and more individuals in an increasingly more complicated world where mistakes are ever higher. Oh, and by the way, if somebody does something terrible somewhere, then it's going to be on the media for everyone to see. Then everyone constantly, Paul Virilio and all that, feel overwhelmed by the information, and it becomes very, very difficult to trust. Well, the blockchain, it comes along and says, well, don't worry, we're trustless. There's no need for trust. That's kind of the big idea, right? It's all just there. You can just see it in its transparency. It's all the work is on the blockchain, and you can trust it. Now, my friend, Mr. Chen, said that it was terrible marketing to call it trust, removing trust. That's a terrible thing to say. It sounds very unhuman, because the issue is that just because it seems like it is cognitively overwhelming and perhaps impossible for the average person to handle trust on a global pluralistic scale, if human beings are incapable of trust at all, there is something that would then make a commons impossible, because then you wouldn't be relating in any human element to one another. So one has to be careful that you correctly locate the functions of the blockchain in the right areas of the stack, right? And likewise, there's a difference between saying, I no longer need someone to authenticate my loan, therefore I have to come and plead and beg for them so that I get my loan and can have my well-being. Thus, there's a power dynamic. And that's why a lot of people will say with the blockchain, you can remove hierarchy, because then, well, we don't need we don't need the meaningless middleman to authenticate. We can all see that it is legitimate. It's like another term, I guess, and people in computer science can correct me if I'm incorrect by this. I believe the phrase is a no knowledge proof, where you don't have to have any expertise or any knowledge. If you just see it, it proves it, right? And what you could say is zero knowledge proof. Thank you, Mr. Field. Most proofs in the world are knowledge proofs. Well, that means you're relying on an expert. That means you're relying on an authority to tell you that that proof is legitimate if it is outside your expertise. And of course, the majority of things in a super complicated world are going to be outside your expertise. So you're always going to be relying on an expert class. Well, now we have a power dynamic. Now we have hierarchy. That could be problematic, right? So the more you could move toward a zero knowledge proof, the more and more you could remove hierarchies and have commons. We relate in terms of all of us have shared understanding of what's going on, and we can therefore make decisions for ourselves based on the work that is transparent for us all to see, not according to the approval of some sort of middleman or boss or hierarchy or things alike. So that's the vision. Now, what I would say is that if you give people transparency, they also have to have, dare I say, the spirit or the towardness or the orientation to one another in that transparency to still be human, right? To still actually have values, that they're not in the act of learning how not to trust anyone, because that could be the danger, right? In the same way that we've talked about, capital can train you to treat everything like a fungible commodity, therefore it loses its fullness. Well, in the same way, a danger could be the blockchain trains you to never have to extend trust because it's always zero knowledge proof. And then you actually get trained out of the ability of giving trust to your neighbor on the commons projects, right? So to me, that is where something like a commons in a personal relationship becomes very important, in addition to something like a blockchain, to keep those going back and forth. But it does seem like something that extends the range of zero knowledge proofs is necessary because of the global scale. Like when you're dealing on that level of complexity and pluralism, that's too much. It's too much for me. It's too, and how could you even trust all of these different things? So you need to provide ways of where people can just look at something, zero knowledge, and then it's proved to them. They can see it. That makes me think of Tyler's project as well, the ability to see something and apprehend the relevant information. So I think those things go together as a system of certification. Those are things that come to mind also. But there's also, I will say, there is right now a lot of the emphasis on the Bitcoin in terms of speculation and making money. And like you say, there's kind of a question of interest there, right? Once we start moving to the question of ways to provide, my interest is in providing these ways of the no knowledge proofs, or these ways of dealing with people to have something they can rely on that would create a space by which they can then more relate humanly without having 10% banking fees extracted here or value extracted, right? Like everything that is extracted by an accountant or a tax agent or legitimacy, that's a percent here or a percent here I don't have to put toward the Voicecrafts or the projects or the OG that I'm working about and caring about, right? So there's an extraction, a real cost, and a time cost that also is being taken by having an inefficient coordination that can happen.
Can I say something? Okay, I lost my thread here. So what I wanted to say is, and I think Daniel touched on this. What is the nature of global governance, right? This is an issue. I believe in multi-level selection theory as like the theory of human evolution in terms of, so once we become human and we have culture, evolution becomes collective. So it's groups that do things that compete with other groups, and then the groups that have the best arms or the best cooperation or the best forms of organization become the norm, and then every other group has to adjust to that norm in order anyway. So we grow through competition. We have to cooperate to win competition, but competition is also as essential as the cooperation. And so that is a fundamental problem when we move to the planetary scale. Because are we able to fuse ourselves as one humanity when there's nobody to compete with? What is the group when you're moving at that level, right? And so I think people are terrified, and we can see this, in the culture war by world government. They're especially because our ruling class today has moved from, now I agree with Varoufakis on this. We've moved from a profit model to a rent model again, right? So feudalism was based on rent. You own the land, and the people who work the land have to pay half of their produce just to have the right to work and live on that land. And so the feudal lord doesn't do that much productive stuff. He just gets the rent, and then ideally he protects. That was like the social contract. Then we move to capitalism, which is based, and I still believe this, mostly on labor value, and getting resources through labor, and then realizing a profit. But Varoufakis argues, and I agree. I call it myself Proudhonian capitalism. So basically, we shifted today to a form of capitalism, which is again based on rent. You create platforms, you make people exchange and share, and you tax them. And you are not producing commodities anymore as a capitalist, right? And so Varoufakis argues that even capitalists today are exploited by the cloud. They have to pay a tax to the cloud in order to be capitalists. And so, for example, there's a German woman, Margaret Kennedy, that calculated already 20 years ago that 48% of the value of anything you buy in the West is repaying loans. So you buy a bottle of water. Why is it so expensive? Because all the people involved in the process had to make loans with with interest, which becomes exponential, right? So this is a real issue, and I think that part of the reaction of the blockchain people and Bitcoin is to escape this kind of permanent rent extraction by big players. So I just want to, I think that is, a very big driver of these people to create, at least for themselves, a way out of the extractive economy, and they are quite successful at it, I would say. And you could even argue they are themselves extracting, because my critique of Bitcoin. So I think Bitcoin is radical because it's the first globally scalable, socially sovereign currency, right? So it created the pivot. So we now know that is possible. At the same time, it's a commodity currency that gets its value because of the speculative buying of it, and it was designed, to grow more slowly than demand. So it was a very clever play, but it extracts money from everywhere else, and then it wastes a lot of that value on energy expenditure, right? Okay, and so that's an important pivot, and the blockchain is also an important pivot because it's the first universal ledger, right? And I think so. We are moving out of a historical phase where we had competitive entities that had only a vision on their own reality. So state accounting, national state accounting, private corporate accounting is you only know what you're doing, whether your capital and profit are increasing or not. And you have no moral obligations for the common good. So a nation state has no obligation for the earth. A corporation, has lots of externalities that it doesn't take care of, right? So now we shift to this new vision, which is more like sports. Like, yes, we're still competing, but we have these rules that are our commons, right? So this is an enormous shift because now what we're creating, and I call this the fourth sector, where you have state, market, and non-profit, but you're creating a network-based system with commons to hold them at a higher level of integration, right? And we create these permissionless contributory systems where all people, all agents can come in and out as they want. And you can be a market player, you can be a state player, you can be a non-profit player, or you can just be a citizen, a contributory citizen, and you're enclosed in this higher level of integration. So I think that's kind of maybe important to say that we are attempting, so every transition is differentiation integration, right? And you can go either below, so you cannot deal with a higher complexity, and so you collapse to a lower level, like feudalism after the Roman Empire was not more complex, it was less complex on the Roman Empire. Or you can do what we did after feudalism, which was more complex. So capital state nation was a new way of integrating everything that existed before, avoid religious war. It pushed religion to the margins, but it allowed religious pluralism and religious belief. So it achieved more differentiation at a higher level of integration. And I think this is what we're attempting to do. I'm not saying we're succeeding in it yet, because it could go the other way. We could have a dark age, but that is, I think, what the blockchain attempts.
Thank you, Michel. All right. So this is the part where we're momentarily going to invite everyone else to step in. I'll change the spotlight over shortly. There's a lot in the air here. Questions of legitimacy, values of identity, of binding, and part of the point you're making there, Michel, as well, that if I'm not wrong, you're articulating the promise of the blockchain space, the promise of blockchain as a capacity to connect more of the externalities created by a particular context of functioning, and to have that represented in a broader context.
Can I say one thing? So,
yes.
So the big issue of the current system is externalities, right? It's really that. It's inability to police its own excesses. So we have hyper extraction, and we don't recognize contribution. And so we could say we have a productive economy which creates commodities through extraction, which has pushed out for 400 years the cost of it on nations and the global south, and originally the Western working class as well, very heavily. So it has externalized, and we were attempting to have a new system which is integrative of the externalities, which has still has a productive economy. We can't do without eating and mining, and especially at our level of complexity. But at the same time, we cannot do that no longer if we ignore the destruction of the biosphere. And so I
Yes.
think that so this is my personal program, if you like. It's extending the Western social contract to the whole world, like minimum decency for everyone, healthcare, education, housing, what the Western working class has obtained after World War II. So that's like the big social thing that needs to happen. And then the ecological thing that needs to happen is a new partnership with nature rather than a pure extractive relationship to nature. I think those are the two challenges. Now, I'm not saying the blockchain alone is going to do that, but I think it's one of the main tools that we need to think about in order to achieve all the other things as well. Because the nation state, the capital nation state model, has not been able to take into account externalities. And so we
Yes.
need somehow to go beyond those limitations.
That's a fair point. That's a fair point. Daniel, we'll pass it over to you once we welcome everyone in. I would just like to signal to the listeners, as well as everyone here today, that part of what, Michel, I hear you pointing towards there, if I can broaden it just slightly, so now to speak perhaps in a way that's not reflective of exactly the view you're trying to put forward, is this seeking of a better relationship between humans, technology, and nature. That's another way of looking at this. This will be a core and ongoing inquiry in the context of Voicecraft. And I'd just like to bookmark that a lot of what's coming through for me here, which is really on the pulse of at least where I've brought a real tension of inquiry that's also matched with a kind of strong intuition. And those are always really interesting ones, right? We're kind of called to a particular area and we feel we're in touch with it in a deep sense, and yet to bring it to an articulated point might not yet be possible in a manner that really enables a commons of understanding. We have to undergo this kind of process with each other and build up that kind of discourse. And so I'll just bookmark and flag for further discussions that a lot of this is for me to do with the relationship between measurement and mystery, and in particular what it means to measure contribution. And I think that's a lot of what is at stake in what can, on the one hand, tend towards the kind of sensocratic, authoritarian, social credit type systems, and then other types of ways of seeking to represent flows of value in a manner that's actually conducive to a healthy, qualitative, right relationship between humans, tech, and nature, factoring what you've said very well, Michel, with respect to externalities in the biosphere and what have you. So with that, I'd like to bring to conclusion this part of the session. Thank you, both of you, to Daniel and Michel. And now we have Aspasia, Kyle, Tom joining us. We also have Tyler and Josh in the lobby. There's Tyler. What I'm going to suggest, I'm very curious to hear some initial reflections that, even if they're just reflections of this part of the dialogue, or these types of themes or topics were interesting to me and they really grabbed me in a particular way, without necessarily the pressure of converting those into a real tight continuity of exploration. Partly because I imagine that we could continue that exploration exactly as we are, and it might not leave as much space for anyone if they want to share just that was important to me. So I kind of want to make some time for things which might not immediately feel to you like they fit together into the flow. But by the same token, if anybody really feels like it and they just want to jump right on it and continue, that's there too. So I'll just leave it open to the space and for anybody who'd like to contribute. Yeah, I see you laughing at me, Tyler. I see you, motherfucker. All right.
I have something to kind of throw in, a perspective around what, Michel, you were talking around trust and this evolution of trust over the last 5,000 years, from the little brother, little sister to the big father. And part of that was, you mentioned like the fear of God and that shared religiosity. I think the example you gave was like between two Muslims, and then this transition to the bigger mother. I think for me, when I've contemplated this notion of trust and this binding effect, and we'll tie this into currency as well in a second, but for me, it all points back to higher intelligence, where most of my life for the last 7-8 years has been just pointing more and more and more in that direction from a lived experience, in terms of just being shown, not multiple times, but thousands of times, like the more I can learn to connect to that and trust that, there's an intelligence that's operating at such a level outside of this conscious self that is capable of coordinating things so far beyond what I ever could. And so where my trust ultimately lies is, can I feel someone's intention to align with that intelligence, and how strong is that intention, and how much integrity do they have to hold that intention in the face of other things that are going to try to make them choose on the basis of fear. And a lot of people I'm really close with in life, I have that relationship with, where I'm extraordinarily confident that that is their strongest intention, and they've shown me many, many times that they're capable of doing that. And what that's unlocked from a value flows perspective is very different than I think what would ever be possible from a state of, there's a lot of ways you could language this, but like separation consciousness. And I don't mean that in terms of like a literal separation, because from my perspective, like that's the distortion. I mean the idea that we're separate, and the effect that has on our consciousness and our psyches, and the effect it has of this innate, really deep desire to try to place ourselves above somebody else at the deepest possible level. And if you can step outside of that at the deepest level and realize, no, if we have that single shared intention that's extraordinarily strong, that we're both aligning to this higher intelligence, if you tell me, hey, I have this soul level knowing that I need to do this, I don't have the funds to do this, like I don't hesitate at all, not even for a second, and I'll direct funds in that direction. And 100% of the time, in hindsight, I'm like, oh, wow, that was one of the best decisions I've ever made. And not only is it one of the best decisions I've ever made for that person, because to me, that's love, right? Like I'm not doing it for any other reason, except for that I know it's the right thing to do. But an effect of that is, I've also seen 100% of the time, it actually is what's best for me, because as that person uplifts their life, then they're able to give more to around them and their state of being, and how the effect that has as an echo back on me, and my life then uplifts. And it's that cycle. And so for me, when it comes to currency, any kind of structure that's instantiated itself in the world, the most important thing is it in service to that? Is it in service to higher intelligence, and not replicating a structure of consciousness which is based in separation and fear? And if it's doing that, like it's doing well.
Yeah. To jump on the back of that, to do that requires people to be able to sit with the discomfort, though. You know, I come back to this point time and time again, and that making making a trusting act is stepping into an unknown always. It's vulnerable. And so you have to be able to sit with the discomfort that will naturally come with that as well. And I wrote in the chat when you were talking about, you know, the big mother, that this is, in my mind, like a toxic comfort. This is the competition for comfort that you know, it is the infantilizing mother, the devouring mother. That is what this big mother is, I think, that we're talking about here. And it's leading to competition for comfort, which is played out, you know, such as the victimhood kind of Olympics that goes on, and ultimately it's facilitating a need to seek comfort from the other, as opposed to learning that one can do that for themselves. Like, if we're going to use that distinction, I need to rely on the other person for that, and that something devastating will happen to me if I don't. And so it goes back to the fear distinction, right? Like this comfort and fear. And you know, some people are just more fragile than others in their personality structure, and that fragility is preyed upon in a system that is prioritizing comfort in that manner, right? So I just don't quite know what point I'm trying to make, but in order to be able to learn, in order to be able to learn how to sit with the discomfort that comes from necessarily trusting and making these moves, there has to be some experience facilitated for people to do that, to learn that. It's not just going to, go Tim, jump in.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering in what you're raising here, Aspasia, if in the context of the conversation about, let's say, technology and systems, something like blockchain, again, something like pointing to a very big category here, I wonder if there's this, there's like a question around cultural technology that's in service of something like mediating the variance of likely delusion associated with exactly what's in discussion here, this choosing from a perspective of more or less intelligence. I'm trying to factor some of what Kyle's speaking to, and you're kind of giving us, Basira, sort of a psychological perspective on the great challenge of cultivating the capacity for discernment. And so in principle, obviously, culture and education and systems function as something like, I'm not trying to be tight with language here, but like, you know, handholds, fail safes, and what have you. And here we have, in the context of blockchain, trustlessness being used to mediate the transferal of, you know, some allocation of, in this case, you know, digits, but people argue a kind of digital energy as well. So anyway, I'm only offering that as a link.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think it's the case, like social media in a general sense. There's a reverence that is ascribed to people aggressively seeking comfort and, you know, aggressively standing up against anything that instills fear or brings discomfort into them. Like that's revered as, that's apparently psychologically healthy now, that things shouldn't feel hard and you should never feel anxious and don't be stressed. And if you are, it's because someone else did something to you, and seek comfort, and it's applauded and it's revered. And I mean, I see it in my clients so much now, and the link to social media is the factor here. You know, this is the sea they're swimming in. And you know, they turn up and you know, give me social media posts and tell me that that's what they need. Anyway, yes, there's just some model being set up here and it's regressive. That was the other point I was going to say. I think that's obvious to everybody, but this is regressive. This is going back to becoming a dependent child in a pathological sense. And that's what I mean by the system. The big mother here is instigating this over dependence of the child, and regressing everybody in the process. And it's toxic comfort, and it's actually it only hurts you in the long run, and it stymies autonomy. Obviously, it's attachment over autonomy and authenticity.
Can I intervene, Tim? Is that okay?
Not at all.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that so I don't want to come across as like idealizing the blockchain culture. So I completely resonate with what Aspasia says, and okay, this is another debate which we might have another day, but I think fundamentally, we came out of a patriarchal, male-dominated culture, which has a lot of issues, but now we've kind of gone to the other side of the polarity, and I think the male part, the healthy male part, is completely being ignored, and we get into the toxic femininity. But that's another debate that we can have. And so I think we need to come back to a new kind of equilibrium. And of course, the reason I say that is because I think, of course, in the blockchain, it is male dominated, and so that's why I stress the rules of reason, because so what they're trying to do is, because they're so so the blockchain ideology comes out of something called Technocracy Inc., right? It's an ideology that wants to create a world where humans don't have to negotiate and deliberate to make decisions. As much as possible, automate decision making in these neutral, algorithmic, consensus-based, and that's very questionable. I'm very, very skeptical about that part of the blockchain. And so, but then they also sense that they need high touch, right? So they have organized these Zuzalu meetings in the Ethereum community, where, and there's a very interesting phenomena, because they're transnational and translocal, and they need identity and roots. They're creating a translocal series of events. So this is what the civium is, what Jordan Holt speaks about, is they're creating like a parallel world where they can constantly meet with each other and be friends and talk to each other and learn from each other. This is called pop-up cities. So this is actually very interesting by itself. And I just want, I'm being a bit of an anthropologist here, just, relaying my experience, is that I was sitting on a table with a deep adaptationist, an impact investor, and a climate denialist, and they could talk together. And I thought, wow, that is very valuable, because that's something that is increasingly impossible to do in a social media infused world where people are always fighting and attacking each other. So, but the fact that they were all working on the same infrastructure, which would be useful for all of them, that created a commons that they could then talk to each other despite these very steep differences on the ecological front. But then I went to Zuzalu Istanbul, another of these meetings. And to be honest, after I was planning to stay there 2 weeks, and to be honest, after a week, I just couldn't stand it anymore, because they're all engineers, they all do game theory, and they do Austrian economics, and that's it. So that's a very problematic part of the blockchain ideology and culture, is that it comes out of the very, very specific minoritarian ideology, that to me is not linked to higher intelligence at all. It's a very mechanistic vision of the world, and very limited, because they think Austrian economics is economics. They think game theory is how humanity functions, but they don't know cooperative game theory. They only know competitive game theory. And so that's, I want to say this because, in terms of a cultural critique, this is a real weakness of that culture. So I'm not saying that everything of the whole solution is there, but I think they're doing something important. But let's say the high tech part of the tools is interesting, but the high touch part, that's not coming from them. So we will need a infusion of probably more female facilitation based, you know, another type of infrastructure, right? That can compensate for that abstraction, that planetary abstraction that Daniel talked about.
There's lots of directions there that I'm drawn on. They certainly do require their own time. Any time for me, the language of whether the masculine or the feminine, men and women, mothers, fathers, gets drawn into analysis of other features of society at different levels, I recognize how much value there is, in my opinion, to speak about those dynamics at length on their own terms, even though, of course, they manifest in all these particular ways. Yes, I'm very curious about, so nodding that, I'm curious about what types of contexts men are more suited for. The masculine is in a more active mode in, and what context the feminine is in a more active mode in, what context females are more suited for and less suited for in both cases as well. And then also what a kind of dynamic and appropriate and transformative relation is between the two, and how often might we think of a context as needing more of one or the other, as actually what it really needs is a right relationship between the two. And so there's just so much there that I just want to flag that as with a lot of openness. In the time we have left, though, and there's so many things, Daniel, would you like to jump in?
This is delightful. I appreciate everything that's said. So a few things. There are many different things: blockchain, Bitcoin, Ethereum. Some people argue Ethereum has options that the others do not. Crypto could be, et cetera, so forth. And like I said, the different technological distinctions and differences, those are for experts to talk about on those fields. And also too, on the idea of the ability to look at a blockchain and it be this kind of no knowledge proof, I do question the amount of wouldn't that require some level of expertise for that to work and to understand? I don't know. Those things could be ironed out, but these are the arguments you hear people say. And I'm extremely interested in those arguments because, so for example, if you want to get a loan in a third world nation, you don't have documentation, it's basically impossible. You may have to walk a very great distance. You may need to know somebody in government, do different favors. That seems very unjust. And if there was a possibility of decentralized ways for people to get authoritative documentation. You mentioned the credit score. The credit score seems very outdated, very arbitrary. It seems like, what are even the factors by which these things are determined? Well, if you could choose your own factors by which your trustworthiness could be shown to show that you are worthy of receiving a loan without reliance on some sort of credit agency that exists in a sort of dark realm, that seems like it would possibly create justice and would possibly remove unnecessary power dynamics. All of that seems very worthy to consider. The other thing I would say to the defense of the notion of trustlessness, it does seem as if AI is about to make the entire internet impossible to trust, where it may be the case that the entire internet is about to be worthless. And so if we don't have something like the blockchain that AI cannot screw up, then there is no internet. See, that's another reason why it's almost like a lot of people are like, well, it doesn't really seem like right now the blockchain is being adapted widely. There's a lot of people interested in the speculative potential of Bitcoin. That seems to be the case. But in regard to this idea of a trustless system that is no knowledge proof, all those things, whether or not it actually does that or not, let's just hold that aside. It would seem like something like that is absolutely, utterly necessary. If deep fakes are coming, AI, hallucinations, all these different things, like how is the internet going to even be usable anymore without something like the blockchain as being so described, right? So it seems like the AI may actually force the adoption of these technologies, which then, funny enough, if these technologies actually will do something to deconstruct the professional managerial class, various accountant surveillances, maybe dark pools are no more, as I think derivative markets you could question. Maybe the only way any of those things can possibly be destroyed or sublated or whatever is moving to a blockchain, which none of them will actually do unless AI basically forces it by rendering the internet useless. Now, again, I've heard people say that the AI can just hack the blockchain. I don't know. But it's interesting. So I don't know if it actually will have this function. I'm not saying that. But what's interesting is this question of needing something trustless, something that just is, that you can assent to. That seems like very interesting. And I think the point that Fields is making, this is what's very important, though. I do think there's an assumption that people go, if we have a trustless system, everything will work out. Well, no, just because you have the environment of trustlessness, the human beings that are using that trustless environment could be hacked by the AI, just like Josh was saying. And they may not have the values to create a commons in that trustless environment, right? So in the same way, I think you were mentioning Austrian economists. There's kind of an assumption that if you free people, just kind of autonomous freedom, you create wealth. Well, we've talked about this before. Not even Adam Smith really believed this. And I'm almost done with Carl Planier, so our next talk is soon, Michel. Really enjoyed that. You have to make markets. You have to direct people's consciousness to see the world in terms of markets, which I think speaks to Kyle's point, where the people have to be trained in their consciousness to be toward the world in a certain way, to make markets possible, to make being human possible. And you see, if we have a trustless system, but people have still been made by the AI to treat one another in a sort of artificiated way, blockchain ain't going to cut it. You're going to need common values in addition. All that is providing the board. So it goes with freedom. All freedom does is provide the possibility of creating wealth. But if people don't do it, it's not going to go that far. In the same way that I think the mistake, in my opinion, of the sort of more of the communist, some of the communist critiques is that if you remove markets or you create an unmediated space, human beings just get along. Not necessarily. They may just kill one another. There has to be a certain training in addition to freeing people from, say, the tyranny of the capital markets. Okay, you free people from capital. Well, they don't know how to mediate one another because it requires active trust, and that's really hard, and you have to be vulnerable, et cetera, and so forth. So at the very best, even though, again, I'm not saying the technology necessarily does that, but the conversation about blockchain at least frames to me the seeming necessity of something like trustlessness at scale, but then that's not enough to guarantee that we're going to use that space to treat one another humanly, because then, like Mr. Fields was saying, AI just may hack us indirectly, right? So there's more work that has to be done, which then, of course, like Michel's saying, if everyone doing the blockchain are following a certain ideology, well, then it may not take us far enough. There would still be additional work that has to be done. The last thing I'll say, I do wonder if there are ways, if you have blockchain that's a reliable source of information, is there some way, again, I'm being totally speculative, is there some way to put it together then based on prediction markets, where you could say invest in something like a liminal web space based on the reliable information of the blockchain, and you say, hey, I think Voicecraft is going to be able to increase interest in environmental issues by 20% by the year 2027. You put that together in a contract, and if it does that, I take $100, turn it into, say, 120, and Voicecraft gets 10% of the profits. Because the other big thing I'm very interested with is in the sustainability of these liminal web spaces. Is there ways to use these technologies to create investment models, not merely models of giving money? I'm not saying it can, but the reliability, if blockchain provides reliable information of some kind, can that be the basis of a prediction market that then makes possible some sort of modes of investment? Not saying it can. All prediction markets can be exploited, of course, but there may be something to at least consider there. And then the difference is you're using collective consciousness to watch out for black swans, externalities, and different things that are making predictions on the creations of value, not just investing in speculative markets and they have skin in the game. And then what they are investing in gets a percent of those profits. Not sure, but that may be something to consider or to possibly explore. But anyway, those are just thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, we had a conversation once on the podcast, actually. Tyler, you participated in that with Evan and Anderson Todd. I believe it was called NFTs and the Sacred. And that explored something not put so well in terms of how you reference that as a prediction market, but certainly, yeah, it comes back to this relationship between measurement and mystery. If you know, as long as we're staying in the deep philosophical contemplation space of like a kind of design, I think there's something there. I'm just very curious about what would become. I'd be very curious about what kind of metrics ought to be used. I can see that metrics in the context of attentionalism would have a lot of pragmatic utility within that paradigm of attentionalism, but whether that's participatory enough in a real higher touch sense with what matters, and in this deeper sense, I think that's underlying a lot of what we're speaking about here, a kind of, I suppose it's that veering towards the less mediated it's a much less mediated relationship with intelligence. It's more like it's a more adaptive relationship with intelligence, something like this. We talk about wisdom and what have you. Anyway, I want to put a pin in what I'm saying and just open the space up to anyone who hasn't shared anything yet. We've got about 20 minutes left for this recorded component. So I definitely encourage yourself, Josh, Tom, Tyler, to add anything in if you would like to.
I took your encouraging of, say, maybe deeper and slower threads at the outset as meaningful. So I've appreciated all the contributions as I've kept my mouth as shut as possible, even though I wanted to. Oh. All right. So this is extraordinary. It's a great conversation, but it's hopping between so many levels. Like I can't, I usually can't keep up with this stuff. Like it's so bewildering how we jump back and forth between the purely descriptive elements of like how a functional blockchain may work, and then the psychological elements, which are generating the attachment for why they're using it. And it's really fast. Like it was beautiful. Your opening statement, you jumped through, I think you said the internal contradictions with World War I. That was beautiful. I think we're still reeling from that. It's war, trauma, it ultimately generating a lot of daddy and mommy issues over time. And that is the resulting loss of authority, the loss of trust in authority. Okay. And so trying to reassemble that is real and true. Trying to find a way back towards that is real and true. And I think that that as a generative component within young men in whatever country they find themselves in is being preyed upon. It's being fundamentally preyed upon. So I'll make my provocative statement, okay, a la your title of your article. I think that fundamentally what's taking place in the vast majority of the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency landscape right now, despite all of its marketing, despite all of its narrativists, it's primarily dark money moving through criminal organizations. It's primarily schemes preying on people's hopes and dreams about how they might be participating in some beautiful transformative process. And without recognizing like the reality of that, like the total transactional volume on your wallets, like what's actually taking place there, then we can't really have a good conversation about what it's representative of. And overall, I would say no matter what you describe, it's fundamentally parasitic on a much larger system that when it wants to can flex the hell out of it. Okay, so we saw elements of this when everyone got in an uproar over some Reddit floozies, tickling the stock market through GameStop. Okay, like so there, what happened? Some the hedge fund guys came back and flexed the hell out of it. Like this, you can unplug the cryptocurrency market. Okay, it's parasitic on an electrical grid. It's parasitic on a whole lot of things that I think are fundamentally far outside of the control of whatever hopes and aspirations the young men who are attached to it, hoping that they can build a new world in whatever cryptocurrency they choose to name it, arose by any other name. So I don't know. I think most of it's getting lost in like endless churning of distractions. There's not really innovation coming out. There's been yeah. I mean, I've been looking for it. I really have. I've been praying that it is something which is capable of manifesting an answer to that lack of trust, to the rebellious spirit which is building up like a boiling kettle that every country is about to have to deal with, that is dealing with. So our savior does not lie in an adherence to a trustless electric system, which is itself embedded within a much larger system that relies upon all sorts of other things that we have to contend with. And at the very bottom of all of that, I would say I'm much more aligned with Kyle's leading sentiment, which is that a true marketplace, right? A true marketplace is going to be defined by a sensitivity which is necessarily local. Okay. And when you try to like intertwine these local and global phenomenon and pretend that you can somehow reliably predict the influences between them, that's the major failure point. That's always the major failure point. That's when we see, because it's an attention economy. Okay, the value, like this is the problem that I can't have anyone explain to me how you get out of this. The value of cryptocurrency is predicated purely upon attention. And so he who controls the attention controls the value. Okay, so it's just another proxy game. It's just another proxy game. And I want to know, how do we break out of that? That's what I want to know. Like, what is the actual currency?
I think these are good questions. Yeah, just one moment, Michel. I think a lot of what you're bringing there, Tyler, is a really nice summation, really, of, I think, the various aspects of the conversation. Obviously, you're bringing in the shadowed element of criminal activity, what the networks are actually getting used for. That should definitely be incorporated in the total space. But that's still drawing you in many respects to bring the pulse of the question and the inquiry to what I feel as though was in fact the pulse of the inquiry. And so in that sense, I feel that yes, there have been many different things brought in, but it does seem to me that there's a coherence of seeking here. And I do think when we talk about our relation to attentionalism, and then I do think it's relevant to consider what Daniel's bringing in terms of the forcing function of AI making the internet uninhabitable from is this a deep fake or whatever else. I think it's not closed to me, the question of, to the degree we want to operate in the internet, to the degree you want to, just give me one moment.
Yeah.
Just give me a moment just to make it properly. To the degree we want to operate in the cosmos, in the digital. So that's kind of like a first place of the decision tree. It's like, yes, local, higher touch, trust of deeper capacity for communication and all of that. We can't be profaning the importance of any of that. But to the degree we remain in touch with the digital world, then that question to me has been of interest for many, many years. It's like, can blockchain play a role in authentication of participation in the internet? Not blockchain, but can technology play an authenticating role in participation? We're different from the pure attentionalist aspects. I'm not pushing back at all on the value of present communities in that context. But we often, a number of us have spoken about we spoke about this with Cadell the other day, or at least I spoke with Cadell the other day, the kind of beyond attentionalism as, wondering more actually about the dynamics of participation. And so, yeah, I think there is like some sort of glimmer of a way through there. And I don't think this conversation is about getting trapped in crypto being the answer, but very much does point towards what is a wiser relationship with technology, and crypto's kind of being articulated as an instance of the manner by which, in principle, the technology of the digital can play some sort of functional, genuinely legitimate role. So are you still open to that as an inquiry?
Of course. Aren't I allowed to take a firm stance though? I mean,
no. Of course you are. Of course you are. I'm just trying to get clear, because it could be the case. You could take the position like, actually, it's all just going to come crashing down. Forget the fucking digital. That would be
yeah. I mean, like I got all sorts of
I
got all sorts of levels of analysis that I can include that in if I want to. But how do I actually have? I got no purchase on those numbers. Like, you can do statistical stuff for a major solar flare event, likelihood of collapse of whatever, right? You can do that if you want to. There are plenty of people that have been doing that. So, but the nature of all of these things is that catastrophe response. There's all sorts of other machinations occurring underneath all sorts of motivational states, okay? But the failure modes matter a whole lot. They really matter, like a lot. And when you're building a system on something, look, I'm partly making these from a very privileged place. I'm making these criticisms of capitalism and our culture from a very privileged place, right? But the infinite fungibility of money is a problem. Okay, and the more and more that we have exacerbated, look, money is a means by which we produce, right, in a capitalist system. It's how it's, so the traditional friction on that system is provided through loans, okay? And those loans, however they're generated, are a process of approval, okay? When you loosen that approval process, you get the subprime. Okay, you can bundle that up and you can obscure it for as long as you want and, recollateralize it a million times. But eventually the chickens come home to roost. Okay, so what I'm saying is much of what's occurring in cryptocurrency is that. Okay, it's just pushing it down the road. And when I look at the actual fruits, and how they and like if they're crossing boundaries and like having an impact in the actual manner in which they portray it, then I please point me in the direction. But
I hear you. I perhaps too briefly glossed over that with terms like grift, but certainly grift as an exemplar in the common language of like what you're articulating now, I think is fairly appropriate.
Well, it's both intentional and unintentional, by the way. Look, that's what I mean by the
fair.
Yeah. Because I, as a young man with my $10,000, I get into the market thinking, yes, here is the place where I can actually realize myself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And then what happens?
Yep. Yep. So there's a parasitization of the psychological dynamics and the mythology and all that energy and influence. And so the grift can be successful in motivating unconscious activity.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so this is I would never stop here if it wasn't for the sake of a recording, but I just want to pass it over to Michel. I saw you making a gesture before. If you'd like to share anything in closing.
Maybe an example of a project that for me, I find exemplary is Sarafu in Kenya. So I went to South Africa. I met Will Ruddick there. So basically, he started with what is called rotating savings and loan associations. So in Africa, like in Asia, my wife is a member of 3 different ones here. You put some money in a pot, let's say 30 to 50 people, and every week or every month, the whole pot goes to one of the members. So this is used to buy fridges, mobile phones, scooters, things that poor or lower middle class people cannot easily afford, but by pooling their resources they can. So this also exists in the slums of Mombasa. That's where he started. So based on that, he created a mutual credit system. So using the collateral of the savings, you can then have, like a multiplier around mutual credit. So you can say, as long as you have 1/3 of the money as collateral, we can increase the velocity of the exchange. Now, bear in mind, this is for people who cannot afford school, send their kids to school. It allows them to become small market traders, or to become craftsmen, or whatever. So this is something where, in a totally monolith environment where they can't afford anything and are often hungry, this is like very effective. So the basic layer was the savings and loans, the mutual credit system on top of it, which was quite a success already. And then he put the blockchain on it to make it transparent. And as soon as it did that, the system exploded, and then donors came in to because they could see like the multiplier effect of their gifts, on helping removing poverty from a large group of people. And so recently he has another innovation which he calls commitment pooling. So, and I think this is a radically innovative idea. So, okay, so you have a currency, right, that gives you a value. So an apple is so much, a bicycle is so much, 1 hour of, sewing is that much. So what the money tells you is a relative value of one thing over another, right? And so what he's now doing is commitment pooling, and the commitment is to continue to do the relative value exchange, even if the fiat currency collapses. I hope you are still following me. So you have this system, and let's say there is hyperinflation. Well, it doesn't matter, because internally they have committed themselves to the relative value exchange that the money signal gave them, so the relative value of the compound work that goes into any object that they are making. Anyway,
But that's
so why is this
fully
important?
embedded
Because
within. Look, if
Yeah.
like your situation, like you're like hyperinflation in what, like in the total marketplace, then how are their goods and services being exchanged within their little local economy? So like all of that isn't being affected by their choice of local currency. I mean that the how the means of production, like that is still regulated outside of their choice of use of currency. Like that, the substrate itself, again, like it could be like I could make a fancy little engraving that is representative of each one of the transactions taking place on the blockchain in the bill itself. It's no different. It's the same identity number as a receipt that any treasury in the United States gives when they stamp that thing on there and they say this is a good legal tender. Like it's not a different process. It's just in a different domain. And we're using the novelty of it to describe a possible process of utilizing a total, it's like psychic energy in the marketplace of being shut out of being able to make transactions for whatever reason, right? And they need an avenue to go and make transactions somewhere else. So they're going into cryptocurrency. And that's true for criminal elements, as well as increasingly more and more the actual financial instruments. So like hedge funds and everybody else are getting, they're playing ball in all of this now. So,
but there might be a relevant question about whether or not there's possibilities for coordination opened up when it otherwise would be not possible to have the bureaucracy associated with that initial technology that you're pointing to in terms of the stamp and the whole organism associated with. If it's the same move, then is that like, I don't know. Is that
what
not
he's describing is what it sounds like is a good person attempting to provide order and structure in a place where there isn't much. Okay. And then other people are coming in with more funding and they're saying, okay, well, let's contribute to this, and we're lifting these people up. Hallelujah. Beautiful. But you can do that without cryptocurrency. There's nothing value added. Like it's the value add is something about the belief structure is what it is psychologically. because there's something about being tied to the
That's very
novelty.
important. For example,
Yeah.
so most complementary currencies, there's like 6,000 Europe, don't work. They have on average 150 people and like a 2 million euro, turnover a year. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of talk about complementary currencies. They don't function. They function only with highly motivated, ecological people or some homeless people or people with a lot of time. So they don't function. Cryptocurrencies also don't function for these people, and at that level. But what Will Ruddick is doing actually makes a real difference because he creates, a relative value autonomy for these poor communities. And so even collateral, like a lot of people say, why do we need collateral? It's just a social contract. Well, for these people, that's tremendously important. They just don't trust any system that doesn't have collateral. So you can say, money is just a social, agreement. They don't buy it, so it doesn't work. Once they have the collateral, which is their own effort, right? That kind of like created the initial level of success. So I think this is an interesting, unless you want a totally non-monetary system, which is very hard to do in a complex environment, because you have to determine, the embedded value of work. That's another reason complementary careers don't work, because a surgeon doesn't want to exchange 1 hour work for a massage. It just doesn't, it doesn't.
No.
It's
I'm
not
totally with
accepted.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think so. I think
But-
one of the deep values is exactly that. So the ability to spontaneously generate an internally coherent trust system, right? That's the
Right.
value of that process. But I
Right.
think that is separate from the narrative of something like we need to invest in this particular blockchain, or we need
Oh,
to
no.
do.
And by the way, he's not even using cryptocurrencies. Like, this is not a cryptocurrency model. The blockchain is
Right.
only
Okay.
used for the transparency of the transactions and
Right.
basically making the economy visible. He's not using any cryptocurrencies.
Well, so that,
Uh,
yeah. So
So what,
I
what
mean
I
that.
think is interesting in this approach is that it's bottom up, and then the tools are used, very sparingly within a particular vision of a local development. So that he's not, colonized by the global cryptocurrency speculative system. He's doing it like with this woman, making decisions on the ground and step by step improving, a local system. I think this is just an interesting
That sounds very
alternative
wise.
vision of what can be done.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, guys. It seems like part of that exchange there wove back into what was present about 60 minutes ago, sort of wondering one of the questions Michel posed right at the end before we moved into the reflection, something like, what will bind the emerging nations? I was also making that same critique around why this network, why that network. And we've presenced here the importance of a conversation about values and what matters in a manner that's sourcing itself not in mere appeals to the mediation of system. So yes, so here's what I suggest. I suggest we bring this to a close here and give the opportunity for those who are scheduled just to be with us at this time. I think those balloons that came up on the screen must be Zoom signaling that the session was scheduled for a certain amount of time. So here we have Zoom employing the technology of balloons to ensure that the trust of our coordinating together is fulfilled. Can we do better than that? Apparently not. But we'll bring it to a close here, offer that up as an opportunity to bow out, but I'll actually keep the recording on and let's continue for a little bit for those of us who would like to be with these threads here. I just want to thank you all. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Michel. Thank you, everybody else. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. So with that there, if anybody would like to bow out at any time, if there's no easy way to jump onto the channel and say goodbye, feel free to write a message or what have you, because I'm going to step back. I'm very curious, Daniel, what you have to offer. Josh as well, you didn't, I would have been very, and still we could always include something, but I am interested. It feels like from a technological perspective, there's got to be things you're thinking about, and particularly blockchains often distinguish from things like holochain. There's clearly people working on technologies to relate with some of these questions, which we haven't brought in at a level of specificity here. And so that all is very interesting from at least where I'm at in terms of my learning and understanding. So obviously that takes us in a particular direction.
I have my wife calling. I think I'll have to quit here.
Awesome. Really good to see you, Michel.
Goodbye
Thank
to
you.
everyone.
Awesome,
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Yeah, take care.
Thanks.
Bye
Very
bye.
happy
Always
to
a
have been
delight.
here.
Good to see
All
you,
right.
sir.
Yeah, all right. Well, so anyway, that's me out. Daniel, I know you will have a lot to add there in terms of it would have been nice to get last little bit from you there into the, obviously it's all recorded. I don't fucking know. I just think more than 2 hours of this dialogue for people to listen to is a lot, it's a lot of an ask, especially when near the end of it. I feel like there needs to be like a Tyler half hour or something like this. It's always, because it's like, there's,
half.
it's just, it could be the
That
same
should be
thing
like
with anyone.
the Tyler commentary. He does a commentary over the top of it. That'd be nice, like that.
That would be interesting, but that sounds like work. Would you do that, Tyler? That sounds like a bit more work.
Yeah, it would be
that
more,
would be in the
With
work
the hat
category.
on. With the hat on. That's how we know you're in commentary mode.
Yeah. But I think it's important. I think it's important to be present when making challenges, I think, to an idea.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they take time to unfold, and that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It takes it takes so much time to actually really do the work of thinking that translating that into the context of a podcast that is hoping to attract more into that thinking process. Those things, there's like obviously this a bit of a tension there, which is why I'm playing the role I'm trying to play, right? Doesn't mean I'm getting it right in terms of recognizing when and where, like how to treat the.
Just one comment on this. I actually really like the challenge. I think that's really interesting, as like imagining myself as the audience.
Of course,
and
I
so
have no
having a
issue with
forum,
it at all.
Yeah, no, I know you don't, but like having a forum, this idea to actually make that the point of one of these conversations, however you do it. I don't know anything about these things and what works. But I like that idea. That would be, and maybe there just needs to be kind of some framing up front of like the different positions or something that would help it to just, yeah, anyway.
Yeah, no, I get it. Partly what's also occurring here as well is that, in my opinion, part of Tyler's challenge, which in my opinion actually wasn't so much of a challenge, because in large part it was a recapitulation of what was already present, but with some added emphasis of guys fucking seriously. That was basically what it was in Tyler's own. And that then becomes more like the necessity of unfolding what it is to relate with Tyler over an hour and a half for the sake of an artifact, in my perspective, from how that's heard as a piece to the public, right? Because there's like a weight of energy associated with how it manifests through Tyler in that context, because a lot of the ideas, they were, as I said, they were present. You're looking at me like that doesn't quite make sense.
Is that toxic comfort?
No.
No. But like,
No,
if we're like worried, so I get it. So what you're saying, Tim, is that this is like the concern of the outsider audience, how they might interpret the tone. Is that without
not the tone?
Knowing
not the
Tyler?
tone.
No?
Not the tone. The energy required to commensurate, to like gain a sense of coherence about what's happening without it being just like a channel switch. More like that.
Oh, okay.
Something that holds together as something more coherent as an artifact, literally, because it hangs there, doesn't it? So if you like begin a podcast 15 minutes from the end, then you've just begun and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I like that as an opening out to new things. And I could be wrong about this, but my working perspective on it is that when certain threads are brought to a particular kind of close, that also signals, okay, I've metabolized that piece of material, and now if there's new things that are brought, and that's again for the purpose of network dialogue and ongoing things, no issue with that at all. And we're trying to blur the boundaries precisely in this particular way.
We need a binder.
Yeah. 'Cause, 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 Well,
What is the
anyway.
actual currency? I really want to know the answer. These are all just proxies. Okay. They're all just proxies. So I don't know. The problem is the layers of analysis. I love getting stuck in the metaphysical. It's just fun.
Maybe we
But
should.
I don't know about stuck there. That sounds like a
well,
psychedelic
okay,
trip,
fine,
a bad
fine,
trip
fine,
more
fine.
than anything else. But
But maybe there should be the like focused. Maybe it is about, I don't know how that goes down, but maybe it is about choosing a level of analysis in which to stay in for a period of time.
Well, can I take it maybe way back to the question that I always start off with when I think about technology, which is, why do we have it? Like, what's it for? And ultimately, it's something that there's many ways to frame it, but it's something like to improve how life is, right? To create this kind of Tyson Yuncker Porter's notion of increase, whereas obviously the modern world has kind of parasitized that into growth. So like there's a very deep value there of the nature of the relationship between technology and its purpose. And yeah, you can bring in the Forrest language of value and purpose there. Where I've been wanting to kind of, because this conversation, this topic of crypto and markets and currencies and money and all of these lovely related things about how to coordinate value essentially is, I mean, I think about this night and day. And the thing that I'm coming to is, how can we actually provide what humans need, what we need, and provide the minimum scaffolding to start to do that at scales larger than personal interactions, and kind of just restarting the thought process and the thought experiment of how to build infrastructure around that. I know like Forrest has a lot of things to say about this. You know, the ephemeral group process is one attempt to create the kind of collaboration membranes in order to facilitate even engaging in conversational dynamics, as is Voicecraft in a sense. But when you're thinking about things like money and currency, like it's actually important to understand what these terms mean and what these things are. And where I'm at personally is trying to figure out how to actually create or find the free energy in the systems that we have in order to actually start to move the needle anywhere, right? Crypto has enabled and blockchain has enabled us to move the needle in a few more ways. You know, the whole NFT thing was one. This you know, broadly construed notion of grifting is another, and very, very small projects like Gitcoin are able to actually do a minimal amount of work in the space that is still kind of struggling to get a mass adoption or even the kind of culture around it to sustain a community who can actually improve its inherent value as a system. So yeah, I mean, where I'm at, I made a tweet or an X, I guess, a few days ago, which is just kind of an idea of how to move in this space. Just 5 points of the first one being money as ends, which is kind of where we start in modern culture. We just get money, like get a job, get money, then you can live, right? The second is money as means, which is realizing that a life well lived is more important than the money that you get in it, right? That kind of becoming minimum viable adult who can actually function with the right abstractions of relationality. And then the third space, which is where blockchains and holochain and all these kind of currency architectures are operating, is money with metadata. So actually trying to embed more than just a single dimension of value in the system. The fourth then is money as metadata. So this is where the kind of more meta currency and other projects, I imagine Michel would have had a lot to say on this point, which is what systems exist that actually interface with money, in which money is not the main flow, the main component. And then the final piece is non-money currencies, non-monetary currencies, which is just kind of a flow of currencies that do not have the quantitative aspect. Anyway, that's a whole lot, but that's kind of just where my mind has been in this conversation. There's a lot I wanted to respond to Daniel about with what you kind of finished on in the conversation, but I'll leave it there.
Well, I'll just comment quickly. I appreciate what Tyler said. I mean, one of the reasons why I find it sometimes like difficult to talk about a subject like cryptocurrency is similar to where I find it difficult to talk about something like Marxism or capitalism. Because, for example, if I say Marx was pretty right in chapter 1, talking about how everything in reality is turned into an equal sign fungibility, and then people are like, oh, so you're all about like the Marxist revolution. Well, hold on. Once you start talking about surplus value, that's a different ball game. And like that value is created by labor as opposed to labor being a quantifier, right? Likewise, I find when I say, well, the coordination problem of von Mises and, Hayek talking about the pricing mechanism, we don't really have a good address for that. People are like, oh, so you're saying the corporations are good and Wall Street? Well, hold on. So I find that too with the crypto, because it's exactly right. The majority, majority of crypto is a speculative asset market that completely depends on an equity system called, most people are getting their crypto on Charles Schwab, right? They're getting it in the banks that they are opposing, right? Now, on the flip side, in the same way that I go, well, Marx has a good point here. I go, well, von Mises, he's got a good point here. It is clear like that the blockchain can be used especially in third world nations to create these kind of spaces of microloans or authoritative accreditation that creates a kind of protection from the tyranny of the outer system, like he was describing. You can see that. And I also know friends that work and sort of do, in parts of China, they actually can get away, but that's why the government outlawed it and all these people have fled. So you see these things, right? It is interesting, though, to see how crypto is treated in first world nations versus third world nations or Central America. There are differences there. And then, of course, the risk is, you can have a lot of shady activity, right? So I think that's all extremely valid. What I appreciate about the conversation is bringing to the attention all of these little areas that make possible modern life, that then makes you dependent on sort of an external system, that then for me, actually, that actually means that if you want to change the system, something like opposing it is not the case. You have to think about changing the conditions of possibility within it. Because that is then kind of springing within it, which then I think gets into more sophisticated value coordination, right? Which then begs the question, what coordinates value? Like, obviously money, but then of course it doesn't seem to just be money. Money seems to be a quantifier of something like value, but then it can be against it. So what are we doing? I do get interested in things like, again, just speculate. I do get interested in things like a lot of the prediction markets can just be gambling. But if I'm saying I want to use a prediction market as a means to invest because I see a possibility of the coordination of value here in, say, a Voicecraft that is not elsewhere, and I want to invest in that, and I predict some outcome, is that possible? Now, I know there would be the question of who would then take the other side of that contract, what would be the metric, and so on and so forth. But I do want to, because I think the main problem is I'm not seeing blockchain used in first world for investment. I'm seeing it for speculation. Also, too, the potential of blockchain to say, do the function of the IRS is completely irrelevant if the IRS says, we don't accept blockchain. If you say, well, I've got great accreditation on this blockchain, it's like, we don't take that. We only take credit scores, right? So in order for it to have this larger, more authoritative structure, the system, I think, like Tyler is pointing to, the bigger system it's situated will have to acknowledge it, right? Because otherwise we'll say, well, we just take TurboTax, so we don't freaking take the blockchain, which ultimately, to be very sad, in Hegelian, is why, for me, if this technology has something to it, it won't be adopted except with a disaster, like a forcing function. Like there has to be a forcing function. And then for me, that's when you're going to find out if it actually does something or if it's a game, because then when all that pressure of the state saying, well, we definitely need something, well, then it will be crushed, or it will be able to prove it will hold the weight. I don't know, but I don't see any possibility, to be dismal, of the technology being absorbed, because people say, man, all these guys doing this stuff, it's amazing. We as the capital nation state need to absorb it. Oh, heck no. They won't do it unless they say, oh, crap, we're falling apart and we have no choice but to try it. And that's then when you'll find out if it like can sustain the weight or not. And then that's the technical question. I don't know, or different things. But I am quite dismal when it comes to dramatic shifts in the capital nation state. It tends to require some sort of forcing function, but alas.
I think one thing we can say for sure is that there's an adjacent possible that exists as a result of blockchain that wouldn't exist without it, and that the solution of our current set of problems is in part overlapping with that adjacent possible space. And I think this is true of AI as well. And where it becomes problematic is when we think technology is going to enable us to bypass human relationships. But I think to the degree that we are willing to confront human relationship and do that well is the degree to which we can search those adjacent possible spaces and actually find the truth inside them. And I think like all the shit that goes on in the crypto spaces might actually be part of the necessary noise that helps to unlock the real kernel of value that's contained within those spaces. But there's probably going to be a lot of fatalities in the process of that, which is part of the pain that we're trying to bypass with tech.
Yeah, I think that's actually true in a broader context with currency in general. That the failure modes of the leakages of our irresponsibility in attending to the things that do matter, right? The neighbors that are right in front of us. That's what contributes, at least now. It's not necessarily the case in the past, but that's what contributes to the psychic energy that's utilized by people who make promises, right? And so what we're living in is the era of the ability to deceive like never before. Okay, so that means to navigate that, you need to have discernment like never before. There's no getting around it. And I think you're absolutely right that the presence of all of these things, the fabric of the whole of it, if we're, I guess, in some sense, gifted the mercy of that observation, we can learn from it. Else you have to go down into the middle of it and learn that way. So you do both.
All right. Well,
Nice. I'm going to have to shoot off now.
yeah, it's time.
Yeah, there's
time
a
for
lot
me
here.
to
Me too.
thank you everybody for coming along and investing so much time. I really appreciate it. I look forward to the next time, mate.
It was fun. Thanks, guys. Really clarifying
guys.
for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you, John. Thank you, SPC. Yeah, much love, everybody.
All around.
Bye-bye.